Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever you are in the world, and welcome to The Show Must Go Online. I'm Kevin V. Smith, a Chicago-based theater artist and actor, and the director of The Show Must Go Online's Edward II. Edward II was the first show in The Show Must Go Online's Month of Marlowe festival. The Show Must Go Online have been bringing a play based on the works of Christopher Marlowe to your screens every Wednesday in June, and you can catch up with all the previous shows, including Edward II, plus Dido, Queen of Carthage, and Dr. Faustus by buying a ticket now. And on June 30th, you will also be able to watch The Marlowe Lives Cabaret when it goes live at 7 p.m. British Standard Time. The Marlowe Lives Cabaret is a variety night that will showcase Marlowe's lesser-known works and poems performed by creatives around the world. In the meantime, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, remembering, of course, to hit the bell icon to get notifications whenever we post, and follow us at TSMG Online Live on Twitter. That's at TSMG Online Live on Twitter, or at The Show Must Go Online on Instagram and Facebook, and on Patreon. For more updates about this, you'll find updates on the Month of Marlowe and The Show Must Go Online's other work. And you can also post your reactions using hashtag Show Must Go Online. Today, I'm very, very excited to be joined in conversation by someone who was very influential to me in the staging of Edward II, the scholar and author Kathryn Warner. Kathryn holds 2 degrees in medieval history and literature from the University of Manchester and is a historian specializing in Edward II's life and reign. She has written 14 books, including Edward II, the Unconventional King, Isabella of France, the Rebel Queen, Edward II's nieces, the Clare Sisters, powerful pawns of the crown, and Hugh Despenser the Younger and Edward II, downfall of a king's favorite, as well as a number of academic articles. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Kathryn Warner. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, it's great to see you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to see you too. Oh gosh, thank you so much for joining me. I am really thrilled to have you because you were a huge influence on the staging of Edward II, and I've been really wanting to talk to you just ever since I discovered your work. So I'm so happy that you're here.
Thank you. That's so flattering. I mean, really, I've been doing this for a few years now, and it's really just amazing to hear from you that you enjoy my work and it's inspired you. It's really great.
So much.
Yeah.
So much. And I would talk about your book, Edward II, the Unconventional King, is the book that I read that was the big influence. I talked about your work all the time in rehearsals with the actors. Wow. And the private work that I was doing, preparing the play, it informed so many things. And I had about, I think, a month to prepare this show. So it was a very quick process. And wow. I had already a really strong point of view on the play because the play has meant a lot to me for a really long time. Being a foundational queer text and just having, as a queer artist, having seen myself represented in that way in an early modern text was so meaningful to me. And the way that Marlowe, the way that Marlowe has created this text that not only kind of unabashedly shows this romantic love between 2 men, but also the ways that society punishes that, which feels so real and so true and still resonates really with queer discourse today, in my opinion. But also like the overflowing love that Marlowe has for the 4 main characters that I see in the play, being Edward II, his son, Edward III, Queen Isabella, and Gaveston. All of these things had always resonated with me a lot. And so coming into it, I had like I said, a strong point of view, but I was really interested in researching as much as I could in the short amount of time that I had, the historical aspect of his life. And just in a YouTube search, I'd watched to a couple of French podcasts about Isabella of France because I really wanted a French perspective on her and to find out, who she was. And I think right after that, I found a speech that you gave at the Mortimer Historical Society on Hugh Despenser the Younger.
Yeah.
And that's when I wrote you on Twitter because that speech, I really suggest everyone look up this speech. It's fantastic. It was so detailed, so elucidating, and so funny. And when I listened to that, I thought, this is the person whose voice I want to listen to on this topic. And then luckily, when I researched you, I found that you'd written a whole plethora of work on Edward II's life, and you're really the preeminent scholar on Edward II, as far as I can tell.
I've been researching him since 2004, and I started my website about him in 2005, and it's had 3 million visitors now.
Visit Kathryn's website also. That is just it's a wonderful piece of work in itself.
Thank you.
So I found a lot of different books that you've written, and I was going back and forth. Should I read the one about the Queen, or should I read the biography of Edward II? And because I was really interested in creating the piece through the lens of the Queen, at least starting in Act 4 or in the second half, and just fascinated by her. But I decided in the end to read the bio of Edward II because I figured I'd get a lot of information about
she's an incredible
her. Yes, because she's so important. And I'm so glad that I did. So just thank you. I want to say first, thank you for the work that you've done. It's so brilliant, and I just highly recommend everyone to check it out. If you're interested in Marlowe, if you're interested in Edward II, or just, history in general, your work is so readable and so wonderful.
Thank you. My aim has always been with my history and with my research to actually to bring Edward through as a person, rather than just as this kind of remote figure who lived 700 years ago, to share the fascinating details of his life and the kind of person he was. Because although he was a terrible king who ended up being deposed and murdered, he was a really amazing, awesome person, and that's what I really wanted to get across to the audience.
You succeeded.
Flaws and all, but okay. He was great.
Yeah, you really succeeded in that. And I think where I want to start, I want to tell you about all the ways that you influenced the book, and to talk about those. I mean, not the book, but my staging, and talk about those. And you start Edward II, the Unconventional King, with a scene which is his deposition, where he's forced to hand over his crown, which I found really intriguing because also I'd been aware of the Derek Jarman film of Edward II for a long time, and he also starts the film at the end, and it's kind of he radically adapts things, but kind of starts from the end. So I thought it was really interesting that you did as well, and this scene that you create.
I never thought of that. Maybe I was subconsciously influenced by the Jarman.
Well, I started at the end too, so we've all done it now. I mean, because I also kind of ended up using it. I think because the scene that you start with in the book is so powerful and so moving. I was crying within 5 pages, because you described this scene of Edward II, like at the very end, surrounded by all these bishops and nobles and these powerful men who've come to take his crown. And you said that he broke down weeping, and he gave a speech about how sorry he was that he'd let down his people, but in the end he said, "I could not be other than I am."
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about?
Yeah, I mean, I called my biography of Edward the Unconventional King because to me he was very much a man out of his time. He was born in 1284. I think he would make a lot more sense to everybody if he was born in 1984.
Right.
For a start, there's his open love for men, and all the relationships and very serious relationships he had with men throughout his life. He was very much a king with a common touch who enjoyed meeting his common or low-born subjects, spending time with them. I mean, this shocked people at the time. Now, to us, that makes sense. You know, we'd approve of it. This was something that was seen as like almost going against the will of God, who had ordained, you know, the natural hierarchy of society, and like hanging out with carpenters and sailors and fishermen and fisherwomen.
Right. Also, very fascinating point.
Really
Yeah.
shocking. Yeah. And another thing he did, like, he was very much into physical exercise, of going out and digging ditches, thatching roofs. And again, this was really shocking to his contemporaries. So whereas to now, we might see him as a role model of a man who goes out, you know, in all weathers and does lots of physical exercise and keeps himself fit. His contemporaries like, what? A king picking up a spade? Are you insane? So in so many ways, Edward didn't make sense to his contemporaries in the way that I think he makes sense to us. And I think, you know, certainly by the end of his reign, so when he was deposed in January 1327, he was 42 years old. And I think he was aware by then, very much aware of his own unconventionality, of how he didn't fit what his subjects wanted a medieval king to be. He wasn't able to fit it. Whatever he did, whatever he tried, it wasn't going to work. He was who he was.
Right.
And, you know, I think, yeah, he made that, according to one chronicler, he made that very moving speech. I could not be other than I am, because, you know, this is me. This is the unconventional me. I'm sorry I can't be what you want, but this is it. Sorry, guys, kind of thing. I also find it very, very moving.
Wow.
Yeah.
It took my breath away, because I feel, and it took my breath away as a queer person, first of all, because it is such a sentiment that I think that resonates, and as a non-cis person, that resonates so profoundly, because there's always a sense, I mean, I guess depending on where you grew up, or, you know, what you were surrounded by growing up, but always the sense that there's something wrong with you, and that you're letting everyone down in a way. I think it's a very common story. It was my story. I always felt that way, sadly. And then coupled with that, for me, I had just held on for dear life to who I really was on the inside. And I think for anyone who's marginalized, that sense of like having to hold on to their identity, because it's all that you have in the end. And the way that we become so attached to our identity, it becomes, when people try to take it away from you, you have to hold on to it for dear life. And I think that just, so this resonated with me so profoundly, this speech. And
thank you for telling me that. That means a lot to me.
Gosh, it was so, I'll never forget the moment that I read it. I was just in tears. And I used this, I used this as the foundational principle for the whole production.
Right.
So what I'd already decided when I came in to direct this was that I wanted it to be pretend. I wanted it to be visceral, and for it to be vulnerable, because I think that Marlowe's text really demands that, because Marlowe's text is harrowing, and its depiction, you know, as a queer person reading it, the depiction of the way that these two lovers are so brutally torn apart is harrowing and heartbreaking. And so it was very important to me that we tried to stay true to that. And I wanted to use this idea of authenticity, which is what I found in your description of his deposition, in the speech that he gave. Right. This sense of, I can't be anyone else than who I am. And this idea of authenticity then became the guiding principle for the staging, which was that I wanted all the, I just wanted to be as real as possible, for the actors to be making sounds with their spoons and pots and pans, when there was violence that happened on stage, that it was a sound that could viscerally affect the actor, as opposed to some kind of like stage combat pretending with swords, or that when the actors would touch each other or kiss, that they would touch themselves instead. And just this sense of the vulnerability and openness that I wanted the cast to bring to the show, and telling them all of this. I opened my first email to the cast with a quote from with this quote from your book. And I feel that really because of that, we were able to, as a group, go to a place in 10 days. We had 10 days to rehearse and form this. It was so quick. 15 minutes per page we had. And then you never touch it again until you run it. That's how it was. But I think because of that, and because of the inspiration that I got from you, I was able to create this, or we were all together able to create this really open, vulnerable and emotional space for the cast to be able to explore and really dive into the text. So whenever I could, I guess in the staging, I tried to do it in the authentic way as opposed to pretending something. And all that came from that quote from the book and from that first chapter. So
Edward, amazing.
Powerful.
I mean, I also find it very touching and moving that he had, that kind of courage to live his own life the way he wanted it, and not to hide his love for men. He just said, this is who I am.
Right.
Yeah. And
I think that also, this is why, I think Marlowe must have also felt the same when he wrote this play. I think he must have picked up on that. And that must have inspired him to write this text, because you can feel his love for Edward so strongly in the text. The way that he depicts him is with such care, and those scenes at the end in Killingworth Castle, I think, when he gives over his crown, and then are some of the most beautiful, I think, passages in all of early modern text. Like, those monologues are just fabulous, and the way that Marlowe seems to relate, I think, to this idea of the outsider, of the kind of queer one, the one who's on the margins and won't be accepted by society. I really feel that Marlowe saw a reflection of himself in Edward's story, and it inspired him. And I think, like you said, the way that Edward seems like someone who would be right at home today, I think that is part of why Marlowe's text has such power, why it resonates the way it still does with queer discourse today, is because of who Edward was.
Yes, absolutely.
Because of what his story was and how he lived.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's a really, really great point. And you mentioned also that in this idea of him being kind of a modern person, that he liked to dig ditches. There were all these passages in your book, which were fascinating, would describe him like when they were on a certain trip, or they were somewhere, that he would go out and join people and dig ditches, or he'd go swimming, or he was always working outside building things. And this, to me, like you said, you wanted to really show the person, Edward, was a huge help to me, and also really influenced the casting of the main role, because I cast the actor who plays Edward in the staging is Zach Livingston, and I've known him for a long time. We worked together in Chicago theater before he moved to LA, and when I was listening, or when I was reading your book, hearing all these descriptions of Edward, like digging ditches and all this kind of stuff, I kept picturing Zach, because he's a mechanic. He's like a car mechanic, and I always see him on Instagram in his garage, like underneath these like classic cars and just like whatever. And he's always outside in nature and that kind of thing. And I thought this could be a really interesting match. And it ended up being a perfect fit. He did a wonderful job in the show. Got a lot of really, really great feedback for it. And I loved that. I really liked following that kind of that path of breadcrumbs that you'd put out into who he was, because I was constantly looking, who was Edward, who was Gaveston, like what were these people like as people, and I thought it would be great to cast him kind of in an unconventional way, you know,
Yeah.
which is what I feel like we ended up achieving in the staging. So
Yeah, I know. I think it was very important for me to know that Edward was like, he was a really big guy. I don't know how tall he was, but he was 6 feet. He was probably 6'2". And, you know, he wasn't like, you know, the way we see him in Braveheart, for example, you know, that horrible film, Mel Gibson trash from a few years ago. I mean, if you imagine like a man who was the complete and total opposite of the way Edward was portrayed in that film, that's the real Edward.
right.
You know, he was tall and enormously strong. So, and physically powerful, extremely healthy. So all the 14th century English chroniclers and even Scottish chroniclers who were hostile to him, they all described him in exactly the same way. Like one of them called him one of the strongest men in his realm.
Yeah.
Another one called him, of enormous strength. And this is just something that crops up in all the descriptions of him, of just how physically powerful he was.
Right.
And I think, you know, because of his sexuality, a lot of people have gone like the kind of the stereotypical or caricatured route of portraying him as kind of weak and feeble and foppish. And this is like the complete of what Edward was actually like. Yeah. And, you know, I think that's really important when we consider what kind of person he was and what his life was like and what his relationships were like, you know.
Right. And it also makes it very interesting in a lot of ways how he was so overpowered by these nobles. And I think that's one thing that, you know, in the sense that I really got from, because that was a big question for me, like, how could they have so much power? And I think, you know, that in terms of the way that things were set up, in terms of how power was distributed, that they just were more powerful at that time. But also the idea of him being this big, strong person. I think this is why people often cast him as kind of like a waifish, you know, or I guess we could say like a more feminine performer in the role, is because, like, how do you explain how he's so bullied and so attacked and controlled by the nobles? But I thought it would be interesting, like, how do we solve this? How do we, you know?
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Yeah.
So another thing that was a hugely important to me in reading your book was to learn more about the life of Isabella of France, or Queen Isabella of France, which you detail so beautifully throughout Edward II, the Unconventional King. I was also really touched by passages where you wrote about her as a child.
Okay.
Where you said, it really helped me, because you think a 12-year-old child, you know, who's gets married to the king. You just read that and it's hard to imagine. And I really liked the way that you stopped to think what it must have been like for her, you know, in detail, to try to get into that psychology. And of course, like you said, she'd known from the time that she was 3 years old or whatever, that she would be the queen, and she was raised to be
to marry Edward, basically.
But still, inside of her psychology, I just loved the way that you delved into that, and that really, I shared a lot of that with the performer who played Isabella, and that really helped us to shape the performance and our take on the character.
I mean, I think Isabella's, you know, extreme youth when she married Edward has often kind of been ignored, forgotten about, or minimized. I mean, and I think, you know, because she didn't become pregnant until 4 years after she married Edward, but why on earth would Edward want to sleep with a 12-year-old? I mean, that strikes me as pretty normal, not to want to sleep.
Right. Hopefully, yeah.
So she became pregnant at 16 and, you know, gave birth at 17, which I think is a lot more reasonable.
And that was really interesting also, the way that you described, because it's related to another thing in the text, which I found to be really complicated, and which I feel is a real problem in Marlowe's text, actually, which is kind of the way that he threads together the Gaveston storyline with Despenser, or Hugh Despenser the younger is known as just Spencer in Marlowe's text. So the way that he threads those together. So your book helped me so much to unthread that and to get a sense of, I mean, Marlowe actually does a pretty brilliant job of kind of putting it together into 5 acts. But still, the Spencer character, I think, especially is a problem character in the script that you have to solve. and
Yeah.
because he's not that well developed. But reading your book really helped me to get that timeline straight and to figure out what Marlowe had done and then what I
Yeah.
wanted to do with it. But I loved the way that you described at the coronation. I believe it was the coronation of Edward II, right, where he was
Yeah.
there with Gaveston, and then he'd
Yeah.
married Isabella, and
Yeah.
she was put off to the side
Yeah.
at like the end of the table, and he hung the flag of Gaveston
Yeah.
behind him at the celebration.
Good.
So they were newly married. They married in France and then moved
Yeah.
to, and then came to England, and then they had the coronation. And I also loved kind of your musings on what that would have been like for Isabella at the time, because
Yeah.
maybe she wouldn't have wanted to be sitting next to them, or he didn't want to talk to a 12-year-old girl, or I don't know.
I know. You just think, well, he'd known Gaveston for like half his life at that point, and they were more
Right.
or less of the same age. And then Isabella, like, what are you going to say to a prepubescent child you just met? I mean, I find it hard to condemn him too much for that. I mean, he was
Right.
pretty rude, but it's
Yeah,
like, looking at it from a personal perspective, it's like, what are you going to say to a 20?
you can kind of understand. Yeah, because he was 24 at the time. 23.
23
Okay.
going on 24. Yeah.
So but I love the way that your book helped me to understand that in the Gaveston period, which that Isabella wasn't against Gaveston, that she never actively sought to. I mean, she was 12 at the time, but that she kind of, I got the impression that she was happy to just let Edward kind of do his thing.
Yeah.
At that time, and then after Gaveston's death, they had a really seemingly happy, healthy marriage for about the span of 10 years.
Absolutely.
Correct?
I mean, yeah, I think it's also perhaps important to note that Isabella was already 4 months pregnant when Gaveston was killed.
Okay.
So we can clearly see that Gaveston wasn't getting in the way of Edward and Isabella having an intimate marital relationship. Right. That I think what got in the way of them having an intimate marital relationship was Isabella's extreme youth. And you can actually see in records of Edward getting much more interested in her when she became 15, 16.
Right.
So yeah, and then they had their son, the future Edward III, 5 months after Gaveston was killed. They had another 3 children over the next 9 years. It's also quite likely that Isabella had a miscarriage a year after she gave birth to her first child, and it's also possible that they had another daughter who died young.
Okay.
So possibly we got 5 or 6 pregnancies here, and their marriage seems to have been really supportive, happy, really satisfying, really, until and then after Gaveston died in June 1312, Edward didn't have him buried for 2.5 years until
I also mentioned that point in rehearsal too.
It's so macabre.
Wow.
But it seems that actually having Gaveston's funeral at the beginning of 1315 helped Edward draw a line under the past, because it was that year that he began relationships with several other young English knights.
Right.
Who don't
like Sir Montacute.
William Montacute, Hugh Audley, and Roger Damery.
Okay.
And I understand why Marlowe didn't include them, but in a way, I think it's also kind of a shame, maybe, that most people don't know about them, and it just underline the pattern of Edward's behaviour of building these very intense relationships with young men.
Yeah.
And then in 1318, Hugh Despenser was elected Edward's chamberlain by the barons. The chamberlain was a very important position because he controlled access to the king.
Right.
And it's also important to note that Edward and Hugh Despenser must have known each other basically their whole lives.
Right.
Despenser was an English nobleman who was the Earl of Warwick's grandson. They were part of that, the English elite.
Yeah.
Despenser had married Edward's oldest niece, Eleanor de Clare, the older sister of Margaret de Clare, who married Gaveston.
Okay.
But Hugh Despenser and Eleanor married in 1306, which the year before Edward became king. So the marriage was actually arranged by his father.
Okay, so Spencer married his cousin before. That was not Edward's doing. He was just already married. Yeah. Okay. Strange.
It's all very strange, but because Eleanor's younger sisters were married by Edward II to his male favourites or lovers, it kind of seems to make sense that he arranged Eleanor's marriage as well, but he didn't.
And were Damery and were the others married to his nieces as well?
William Montacute was already married. Hugh Audley married Gaveston's widow, Margaret de Clare, and
Okay.
Roger Daimery married their other sister, Elizabeth.
Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it?
It's so crazy. So yeah, basically these three sisters were all married to men who were like, probably their uncle's lovers, which is like crazy.
Right. Very strange. And while we're on this topic, I want to talk about this because one of the most important moments for me in the Marlowe text happens in Act 2, Scene 2. And this is, so at the beginning of Act 2, we see Lady Margaret, who's received a letter from Gaveston, and she's all excited. They're going to go to court, and she's going to get married. And then we have Spencer, who's cast in Marlowe's show as like a man who works in the house of her father, or he's like and Baldock, who's his kind of like sidekick. So
he was a real person, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't done any research about Baldock, or not much. So the idea that I had was that, when we go into Lady Margaret's apartment at the beginning of Act 2, that we create this really high femme space, because I just saw we've had all this like kind of masculine stuff in the castle with the nobles, and then in Lord of Gloucester's house, or Lady Margaret's house, I just wanted it to be this like women's dressing room, whatever, just putting on makeup and like having this really high femme environment. And Lady Margaret, because she stands out in the text in such a way, and kind of brings this really feminine presence, became a character that I followed really closely throughout. She's only in Act 2, but there's a moment at the end of Act 2, Scene 2, where she stands up to her uncle and she defends the queen. And this is a big moment in the play for me, because it's a moment of a woman standing up for another woman, and a woman defending another woman to the queen's face. And so this whole trajectory of Margaret was really interesting to me. And also there's a moment at the end where I staged where they're about to go on to their wedding, and so it's Gaveston, Margaret, and Edward, and I had them all come under pull up a sheet and pull the sheet over themselves, and then at the end, and Margaret is under the sheet with Gaveston and Edward, and she kind of gradually realizes what's going on. I wanted to dramatize that internal struggle, which I don't know if it was present in the actual Margaret or not, but I'd love to actually hear you talk about her, and if there was any internal struggle going on with her, or did she feel caught in a trap? Did she realize what was happening?
So Margaret, again, was very young when she married Gaveston. Their wedding took place on the 1st of November 1307, and Margaret was only 13.
Oh my gosh.
Sisters also married at 13.
Yeah.
She is probably the most obscure of her three sisters. Her younger sister, Elizabeth, is quite famous because she lived to be quite old by the standards of the time, and she founded a college at Cambridge, which still exists, Clare College.
Wow.
And a lot of her household accounts still survive. So we know quite a lot about Elizabeth. Margaret, sadly, is rather obscure, which is unfortunately often the case with 14th century women, especially when they're married.
Right.
And that married women often do tend to disappear from the record because they're kind of subsumed into their husband's life. They kind of, officially belong to their husband.
Right.
Unfortunately. And another problem with the kind of evidence that we have in the 14th century is that we don't have anything where people really describe their feelings or their motivation, because diaries didn't exist back then. Personal letters basically didn't exist. So we know what people did, but we don't know why they did it, and we don't really know how they felt about it.
Well, this is what you do so well in your book, the way that you research everything so specifically, and you give all of the evidence, and a lot of times that's kind of the fun of it, right? That we don't know exactly what was behind it, but you present the evidence in such a way that just you fill out the picture like that. So,
I mean, Margaret, she did have a daughter with Gaveston who was born about 5 months before Gaveston was killed, and Gaveston was exiled from England for the second time in 1308, and Edward sent him to Ireland to act as his governor of Ireland, and Gaveston actually took Margaret with him, and they spent a year there together in Ireland. Which kind of, she was still probably only 14 then, but it suggests to me that he enjoyed her company. You know? Whether they were sleeping together at that point, I have absolutely no idea.
Right.
But it does kind of suggest that, you know, maybe their marriage was, you know, maybe a reasonably okay one, that he, you know, he wanted to have her with him in Ireland.
Right.
I do get the impression after Gaveston was killed that then Margaret, unfortunately, kind of then disappears from the scene, and you very strongly, or I very strongly get the impression that it was Edward who was burying his husband and not poor Margaret, unfortunately.
Right.
Like, you know, Edward just kind of like did whatever he wanted to do with Gaveston's body. Like, you know, he had him sent to the
right.
Dominican friars in Oxford. And I have to think Edward's being slightly selfish and arseholish here, to be honest.
Right.
Because, you know, Gaveston was Margaret's husband. But,
yeah.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, Edward was just so madly in love with Gaveston.
Right. And he would pray, he would pay for masses for him for the almost the whole rest of his life.
The whole rest of his life. I mean, yeah, Edward, Isabella's invasion force arrived in England in September 1326, and that's when everything just goes pear-shaped for Edward. But as late as June 1326, you know, just 3 months before that, he was still paying to have masses sung for Gaveston's soul.
Devotion, just
it's total. I mean, that's like, that was 14th, I think, on the 14th anniversary of his death.
Right. Yeah, whenever those little passages would come up in your book, it was so touching in a way, even though it's so complicated. It's always just so complicated with him, isn't it? But so touching to just that long lasting love, you know, is gorgeous. And I think that Marlowe has also really beautifully captured that love in his play, which is something that's just always struck me. But for Margaret and for the other nieces, is there any sense of them rebelling against the king, or is there any kind of evidence of them that they did?
Things went very badly wrong between Margaret and Edward later on. So her second husband, Hugh Audley, having been Edward's favourite and probably lover, had his nose put out of joint by Edward's devotion to Despenser and ended up rebelling against the king in the early 1520s and was imprisoned. And Edward sent Margaret, to whom he had always shown great favour and affection, to live at Sempringham Priory in Lincolnshire, and she was basically under house arrest in a priory.
Okay.
You know, with very good living expenses, you know, for her food and clothes. She had servants looking after her, you know, she wasn't living in poverty, but he just basically like sent her away to the wilds of rural Lincolnshire and just said, get out of my life. I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Yeah.
And their youngest sister, Elizabeth, was married to Roger d'Amory, another former favourite who rebelled against Edward. He actually died in rebellion in 1322.
Okay.
And Edward was actually horrible to Elizabeth. I mean, you know, he kind of threatened her, took some of her lands from her and gave them to Hugh Despenser.
Okay.
And she did kind of rebel against him actually in 1326. She kind of like dictated this document kind of saying like, you know, saying everything that the king and Despenser had done against her. And if Edward found out about it, she would have been imprisoned.
Wow. So does that exist still, that document?
Yeah, this document still exists, so we can see that. Yeah. And Eleanor, the eldest sister, Despenser's wife, she had an incredibly complex relationship with Edward, which bizarrely, I think, might actually have been intimate as well.
Wow. Oh, yeah, I think. Yeah. Okay, yeah, and she was the one who was married to Spencer.
She was married to Despenser. And like I kind of, you know, I go into it in a lot of detail in my book about the sisters, but there's actually a surprisingly large amount of evidence that Edward came to think of her as his queen while Isabella of France in 1325-26.
Yeah, you kind of allude to that or mention something about it in the latter portion of the Edward II biography, which also caught my eye as interesting. And
very strange.
To go back a little bit to the Queen, it was really important to me that I do whatever I could to sort of reclaim her from the myth that's been created around Queen Isabella, because of this Braveheart, because of Les Rois Maudits, the series of novels by Drouin, the French, where I think he called her the she-wolf of France. She's become depicted as this bloodthirsty monster, which is, but also kind of a fascinating one. But it
Yeah.
just feels like a real misogynistic evil queen trope that's kind of been laid on top of her.
Yeah.
What I love about what Marlowe does is that I
Mm.
feel that he also has so much love and interest in her. Although the way he portrays certain things are not true to the fact, but who knows how much he knew, I don't know. But especially in that last scene where she's ripped apart from her son, where Edward III puts her in the last scene of the play, he puts her in the tower to be investigated for the murder of his father. And this scene always just like ripped my heart out, because the scenes between her and her son in the play are so tender and so beautiful, and the language that she uses with him and the way that Marlowe develops that also is another thing that just touched me so much, and I really feel is a second emotional core, or maybe the emotional core of the play in some ways. So, and the one thing that I really wanted to talk about was her culpability or not in terms of his murder, in terms of and his murder, if he was murdered, and also the way that she stood up to him, which you referred to this earlier in our talk when she was in France, because she went to France, and this was during the Despenser period, and then she wrote a letter to her husband, which was, I love the way you describe it in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the letter that she wrote?
Yeah, so Edward went to war against Isabella's brother in 1324. She was the sister of Charles IV of France. So
right. Imagine that position to be in. She was always solving diplomatic problems for him,
exactly.
I feel like.
Yeah. So yeah, in 1325, Edward sent her to France to negotiate a peace settlement, basically, between her brother and her husband. While she was there, Isabella later on began some kind of association with a group of English barons who had rebelled against Edward some years earlier and were in exile in France. And she kind of offered Edward an ultimatum, like, send Hugh Despenser away from you or I won't come back to you. And I think at this point, she was actually really intending to administer a sharp shock to Edward. And expected that, yes, of course he would send Hugh away, but he didn't.
Right.
So he left her basically with no choice but to stay in France and to continue this association with some of these English baronial rebels who were over there. And in early February 1326, she sent a letter actually to the Archbishop of Canterbury in response to a letter that some of the English bishops had sent her, begging her to come back to her husband. And she said that, like, I want nothing more in my life beyond the salvation of my soul, to be in my husband's company and to live and die there.
Right.
But she said she was genuinely in fear of her life from Hugh Despenser, and she just did not dare to return to Edward.
And did you think she had cause to be?
I do, actually, because when I wrote my biography of Hugh Despenser, I hadn't realized before he was a very frightening person.
Right.
That he actually imprisoned a lot of people, men and women, nobles and people of more humble birth, extorted money from them, blackmailed them, imprisoned them until they handed over some of their manors. And then basically there's one letter he wrote to a baron in 1324, which still exists in the National Archives in London. And it basically says, "Give me your manor in Oxfordshire or I will have the king hang you."
Yeah.
So, and this is
charming, really charming fellow.
Baron.
Yeah. Because I got the impression also, that she really did have cause to feel this way. And also I think there was a strong anti-French movement that Spencer was also kind of like spearheading at the time before she went away.
It actually breaks my heart, because Edward and Isabella's marriage had been so successful for so long, despite the presence of these men like Gaveston, Damery, Audley, who Isabella, for the most part, seems to actually have gotten on with quite well. She gave Damery presents. Hugh Audley was like one of her closest allies, for example. And then Despenser comes along, and he was like, determined to alienate Isabella from Edward. He was probably, I don't know, jealous of her in some way, jealous of her power. She'd always been a powerful politician and mediator and intercessor. Edward allowed Isabella a lot of political power for many years. And then in and after 1322, Despenser achieved this major dominance over Edward, and he just sidelined Isabella completely. And it really hurts me, because it seems that Despenser manipulated Edward into thinking that Edward's wife and loyal supporter was actually an enemy alien who was trying to hurt him. And he, so Edward, like,
it's heartbreaking.
lands, and it really, and after all these years of loyalty, poor Isabella finds herself, like, treated as an enemy alien, and
right.
It's really awful, and I feel
that was
so
something
sorry for both of them. Yeah.
It struck me so much in your book, this period between Gaveston and Spencer, the way that their marriage seemed to work so well, the way that she supported him and was like, she was the brain, like she was felt like the brains of the operation, like she was the diplomat, she was the great politician, she was the one who, and that they're like you said, their marriage was so successful. This really helped, and that she was really kind of backed into a corner. And then she sent this letter, which you describe also so beautifully, the psychology that must have gone into her decision to write that letter, and how hard that must have been for her at the time, and it was so brave to do it. And then she invaded England, and she was the last successful person to invade England. And you have this whole trajectory, of this, from this 12-year-old girl, getting married to a man 12 years her younger, being shipped off to this unknown land, all the way to this warrior woman who is like the last successful person to invade England, right? And then, so anyway, your book helped me so much to understand her, and also to do what I felt was to try to do her justice, to reclaim her from this image that's been really, I think, unfairly put upon her, either as you mentioned previously, like a long-suffering victim, which she wasn't, or a evil woman, evil bloodthirsty she-wolf or whatever, which she wasn't. She was a woman who was smart, who was capable, and who was complex, and who was backed into a corner in so many different ways, and responded in this way that's kind of amazing and inspiring, actually. So yeah, a lot of the choices that I made with that performer playing Isabella, it really helped. And also to know, because I think the thing that's hard for any performer approaching that role in the play, is because there's no clue in the play that Isabella and Edward ever had a happy marriage. There's no sense of it. She comes on and she's forlorn, and I mean, I guess she wouldn't be sad unless she lost something, but to be able to kind of, and it's also confusing, right? Because Marlowe lays the Despenser period for Isabella on top of the Gaveston period. But to be able to kind of know all of what transpired between them, and what a successful match it had been until then, I think really helped to flesh out, I guess we could say, the performance. Absolutely. So yeah. All right. I could talk with you for forever and ever. But thank you so much. I'd like to, and I know that you have a couple of books that are coming out, or that you're working on. So could you tell us a little bit about
well, I really like writing about women. So I wrote this joint biography of Edward's three Clare Sisters. So that was great. And I have a book coming out actually at the end of next month about Edward's sisters. So what a lot of people don't realize is that Edward was the youngest of about 14 children, possibly 16. He had a lot of older sisters. I mean, a lot. So I've written a book about them, so that's coming out fairly soon. And I'm also working on a book, although it's at the very, very early stages so far, specifically focusing on Edward's sexuality and his relationships. So this is something that's like, I think it hasn't been done in book form before. So I want to, I can really explore it in detail, his relationships with men, relationships with women. And also what I find fascinating, his relationships with commoners that we talked about. His friendships with sailors and fishermen and fisherwomen and all these people he chatted to. Because there's a lot I can say about his sexuality, I think. It was quite complicated.
Yeah.
His relationships were very complicated. Like, I found in his accounts a couple of years ago, in 1324, he sneaked off from the Tower of London to this house he'd bought on the other side of the bank to make love with a woman, believe it or not.
And he had a son with a outside of wedlock.
had an illegitimate son called Adam, who was born
Right.
quite early in his life, about 1305, 1308. So
Okay.
when in his early 20s, either before he married Isabella or when she was too young to
Right.
be his wife. And then Gaveston also had an illegitimate daughter.
Right.
Who actually has descendants, yeah. So it's possible to be descended from Piers Gaveston. Some people are. Great.
Wow.
That would make my life if I found out.
Yeah. Could be they have all those DNA testing now, maybe.
Yeah,
You
definitely.
find a Gaveston in your family tree. Well, I'm super excited to read these books when they come out, and also just I'm really excited to delve further into your work, because you're such a fabulous writer, and I just want to recommend to everyone, please check out the works of Kathryn Warner. A great place to start, I found, was Edward II, the Unconventional King, and from there, I think it's just there are a plethora of topics that she's written about that are just so fascinating and worth reading. So Kathryn, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me. It was like my dream to talk to you about this. So I absolutely
I've had
loved
a brilliant time. Thank you so much, Kevin. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you. And I said, it's 7:15 here, British time, and I could talk to you till midnight. That would be great.
So could I, all day. So thank you again.
I saw, I've seen some of your playing. It looks absolutely amazing. So thank you for sharing that with me.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely
It
wonderful.
was a wonderful thing to be able to do, and it's a play that I've loved for a long time. And the group that I was able to work with on it were just fabulous. But like I said before, I really think that your work helped to inspire an artistic environment that was so open, that was so loving, that was so conducive to really making something. So, again, kudos and thanks to you. So yeah, again, everyone, please check out the work of Kathryn Warner, her fabulous books on the life and times of Edward II, and also her great website. And we'll put the link to follow her on Twitter below the video, so please follow her and explore. And for those of you watching around the world at home, thank you so much for joining us. And please stay tuned next week, Wednesday, June 30th at 7 p.m. British Standard Time for the Marlowe Lives Cabaret. And that's all we have. Thank you so much.